Mine.
Great. Welcome to House Education Committee on April 12th. Just going to apologize up front to the committee. If you look over the agenda, we are going to be jumping. If you haven't refreshed it of late, we actually have an 11:15 edition. Education Council of the States. It's going to give us a bit of a state-by-state look at restraints and policies, which is the topic we're going to open up with today with some help from Rachel Seelig from the Vermont Legal Aid. And I'm going to turn the floor over to you for your presentation, which is going to give us kind of a look at what exists and what's being proposed and the differences.
Good morning. For the record, my name is Rachel Seelig. I'm the director of the Disability Law Project at Vermont Legal Aid and our staff attorney for government relations. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, for having me here with you today. Just a little bit of background. I know that we've been here before, but just as a reminder, our project represents people with disabilities who have legal problems arising out of those disabilities. We're part of the state's protection and advocacy system, along with Disability Rights Vermont. And over the past 5 years, we have represented around 600 children in special education matters. About 20% of those cases have involved school removals, often because a child with disabilities has engaged in some kind of behavior that school personnel have deemed a threat. So that's really relevant to the second piece that I'll talk about today. And about 15% of these cases, really sadly, involve the problematic use of restraint and seclusion practices on children with disabilities. These are often really heart-wrenching stories of re-traumatization of children who have already experienced significant developmental trauma in their young lives and do not yet have the tools that they need to not become dysregulated. And they end up being put in further danger of harm by the use of restraint and seclusion, and in some cases paired with then exclusionary discipline. So I'm going to start today with H409, which is your restraint and seclusion bill. And I want to start with something the U.S. Department of Education has been saying in their guidance since at least 2012, which is that there is no evidence that the use of restraint or seclusion is effective in reduction of problem behaviors. For this reason, they have strongly discouraged the use of these practices. Although the IDEA does not ban them, the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, does strongly encourage the use of positive behavior interventions and supports rather than the use of restraint, seclusion, and exclusionary discipline. Use of restraint and seclusion is disproportionate on students with disabilities. Students with disabilities make up about 20% of the population of students in our schools. Between students who are eligible for an IEP or an individual education program or a 504 plan. But according to the most recent available data from the Office of Civil Rights, which is quite old, they have a significant data lag. So for them, we're looking at data from 2017 and 2018. 6 mechanical restraints were reported, even though mechanical restraint is banned in Vermont. And 5 of those uses of mechanical restraint were used on children with disabilities. 78.4% of physical restraints reported to the Office of Civil Rights were used on children with disabilities, and 74% of seclusions were used on children with disabilities. So we often talk about Rule 4500, the restraint seclusion rule, as being generally applicable to all students. And while that's true, it does, provide rules about when these practices can be used regardless of disability status. The reality is the vast majority of children who end up experiencing restraint and seclusion in our schools are children with disabilities. Restraint and seclusion can be a form of discrimination. 2 of the documents that I provided to you, and I apologize for getting them to you so late, are documents from the Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights regarding the practice of restraint and seclusion and when it can be discrimination. They provide kind of 3 examples of when restraint and seclusion becomes discrimination. And unfortunately, we see these in our schools on a regular basis at Vermont Legal Aid. We see the unnecessary use of these practices on students with disabilities when their non-disabled peers maybe engage in similar behavior and are not restrained or secluded. We see the use of policies, practices, procedures, or criteria that have the effect of discriminating against students with disabilities on the basis of their disability. And this includes encouraging parents to consenting ahead of time to the use of restraint and seclusion in an IEP or behavior plan, even if the child is not presenting an imminent risk of serious injury to anyone around them. And we also see these events as resulting in the denial of free appropriate public education, because the trauma the child experiences makes it even harder for them to access any education at all. The school becomes a scary place to be. This is not true for every student. This is not true for every school. But in our view, for it to happen to one student where it makes it harder to get into school, harder to access school, is a problem. And it's a problem that we need to resolve. I want to provide an example of a student that I worked with and unfortunately continue to work with, who a couple years ago was very upset. They'd had a conversation with a family member, gotten information that they didn't want, and they were at school. They were very, very upset by this. And they made a statement that was perceived as being a suicide threat. They were not in an unsafe place. They were in a nurse's office. They were with people they trusted, who knew the student's history, which included significant post-traumatic stress disorder. Despite those folks using the plan that existed for the child, a school administrator arrived on scene with police officers because the administrator had decided the student needed to be taken to the hospital for crisis screening. The officer put their hands on the student, which triggered the post-traumatic stress disorder. The student tried to rip their body away, and this led to them being tackled to the ground in a prone position, restrained by being pinned onto their stomach, and then handcuffed, with handcuffs so tight that it drew blood and left bruising. For months, this client could not talk about the incident. Not with me, not with a counselor, not with their parent, not with other trusted adults at school. With some distance, she and I were able to talk. And she said to me, I could tell when he was tackling me, he abuses his power just by the way he was trying to restrain me. His grip was really, really tight. And apologies for the profanity, it was fucking scary. Some of that day remains fuzzy for the student because one of the things that can happen when you're in a traumatic situation is you dissociate. And that absolutely happened to this student. Unfortunately, things didn't get better when 3 days later she was asked to return to school. She was allowed to return to school and without telling her or her parent, expected to participate in what's called a re-entry meeting to go over the incident and talk about what had happened. She wasn't prepared for that. And while she was regulated when she arrived at school, once they asked her to start reliving this traumatizing incident, she became really escalated. And part of her plan was that if she was escalated, she was to take a break, to take space, to be on her own, to do deep breathing and listen to music. The school was anticipating that that was what was going to happen. And so they called one of the police who had come to bring her to the hospital 3 days later to stand outside the door of this meeting. And when she left the meeting room, the police officer followed her into a bathroom. And when she would not cooperate, again got into a tussle with her that she was able to escape, but also left her bruised and terrified. And so she was sent home from school. Right now, Rule 4500 does not govern the actions of police in schools. I think that's a big shortcoming. I don't think adults in the buildings with our students should be able to mechanically restrain students. I don't think they should be allowed to do prone restraints of students, regardless of whether they are school personnel, contracted, designated agency staff, or police officers. Because the reality of this experience for kids, regardless of its intent, whether it's to be therapeutic or keep the child safe, is that it is terrifying and it is traumatizing. And so it needs to be used as rarely as possible and as safely as possible by people who are trusted by the student, and strangers coming in from the outside who have more reign to engage in mechanical restraint, prone and supine restraint, and other forms of restraint just makes things worse. We had another student who was under 7 years old with a known history of homelessness and observation of past domestic violence, who in the first month and a half of being enrolled in kindergarten was secluded several times in a padded room, to such a degree that the parent decided, I'm just going to pull my kid out of school. No one's listening to me. No one's talking to me. They keep putting my kid in this padded room. So they tried again the next year. And the next year, the student was restrained 5 different times. Several of those restraints were later determined to have been improper restraints that violated the rule, but it took filing a complaint with the agency and alleging that those violations had denied the child FAPE for them to even be reviewed. We've had other experiences where we did not allege a denial of FAPE, and therefore the agency simply did not review whether the restraints themselves violated the rule. And one of the things that we have consistently seen is that the need of the child for remedy is not addressed. So there was a situation where administrators were placed on leave, removed from their positions, lost their license. The child who experienced those restraints got nothing other than being sent to a segregated setting. And until we came along and said, hey, wait a second, this child was so severely restrained that people lost their jobs, and we're not even looking at the need for this child to receive compensatory education. And the response from the district was, we took all the action we needed to. We got rid of the people who were the problem. But the child is still there. The child still needs to have some kind of remedy. And that's another shortcoming in 4500, is that there's not a way of ensuring that the child who has been harmed receives some kind of compensatory education for the harm that they've experienced. That's something that is not present in Rule 4500. That's something that is also not present in Bill H409. So we have a lot of problems with restraint and seclusion in Vermont schools. In our view, that these are overused practices, that we still allow prone restraint, I think is a significant problem. And I think you'll hear from other folks that we agree that prone restraint is something that should be banned. We continue to see this disproportionate use of restraint and seclusion on children with disabilities. We don't see adequate data collection. I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. We don't see a meaningful investigation or review process of whether the restraint and seclusion met the terms of the law or violated those terms, or a way of remediating that for the child and the family. We don't see adequate oversight of training and use of restraint and seclusion by the agency. And we don't see parent training on how to respond and how to work with a school once a child has experienced a restraint and seclusion, to prevent them from ever needing to have that experience again. So when we read 409, my conclusion was that it really doesn't take steps forward relative to what we currently have in Rule 4500 for the most part. It overlaps with what is already in the rule. And in some places, it's actually less comprehensive than Rule 4500. A couple of examples of that, mechanical restraint is actually defined in a more limited way in the bill than it is in Rule 4500. The definition of physical restraint is broader, but then the prohibitions on its use are more limited than they are in Rule 4500. And the definitions of seclusion and chemical restraint are not substantively different. The one positive I do see is that it appears to me, although the language is a little bit fuzzy, to recommend a full prohibition on seclusion. So in my view, I'm not sure H409 is where it needs to be if what we want to do is protect kids against the use of restraint and seclusion. I do think there are some things that we can likely all agree on, such as removing the permission to use prone restraint. I do think that we can all agree on improving data collection and on having improved oversight of the use of these practices. So I'd like to go into each of those in a little bit more detail, but before I do, I just want to pause because I've been talking for a little while now and see if there are questions.
I don't think so, but I suspect there will be at the end. Oh, we got one here.
Yes.
Tell me again what FAPE is.
Yes, FAPE means free appropriate public education, and that's the right that students have under either an IEP or a 504 plan in terms of what they get to have from their public school.
Senator,
Oh, yes, I love that.
She's been promoted.
So I'm just trying to clarify because I feel like we're talking about two things. One is the use of seclusion and restraint for discipline. And one is the use of seclusion and restraint for safety. And I think we can all, I mean, I can't imagine that we couldn't all agree that it never should be used for as a discipline. There's no way that that's going to teach a child.
Yeah.
But are you talking about safety, a child leaving the school and not coming back, a child picking up scissors and running around the classroom, a child picking up a chair and throwing it at a teacher, which is all things, is that what we're talking about? Is that kind of situation?
So yes, but I would characterize it a little differently. For the child, it doesn't matter whether you're doing it for safety or for discipline. It is traumatic either way.
Yep.
And I think the best practices, and you've got a member of your committee who understands best practices, is to do de-escalation.
Absolutely.
Right? So a child throws a chair, you step away, right? You let the child throw the chair, you don't get hit by it, you step away. A child's got scissors, verbal prompting is a really good strategy to be like, hey, we're going to walk with scissors, not run with scissors, right? So there's a lot that we can do before a child is really at the place where they pose that imminent danger of substantial bodily harm, right? To themselves or to others. Mm-hmm. And right now the rule also says, or damage to property. And quite frankly, unless that damage to property is going to hurt the child, I don't see a reason that damage to property should be a reason to traumatize a child.
I'm going to follow up on that.
Yeah.
And I'm just remembering back to the testimony we had from the gentleman who was on Zoom and basically said, when we talk about restraint, we're not talking about pulling a kid away from a fight or stopping a kid from running into.
That's right.
That's just separate and apart.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so a kid running after another kid with scissors and intervening.
Yeah. Momentary intervention is different than restraint. Yes.
Representative Rose.
Yes, thank you. When one of these situations happens, it's likely to happen in front of a group of other children. Do those other children get any kind of support for that situation?
If a school is using best practices, absolutely they should, right? It should be part of the practices of doing kind of restorative circles and repair, doing, education on, what disabilities are and what it can look like and how we can support our friends and our peers, right? There's a lot that can be built into curriculum in order to have those safe and inclusive schools and help kids understand their friends and their feelings. That's an independent
thing that the schools themselves implement, those types of things.
They should be,
Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so if in what I think should be slide 14 for you, I've got a data collection pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid are school administrators who are supposed to get a report on Rule 4500 use, so a restraint or seclusion, by the end of the school day. Parents should also be contacted by the end of the school day, but they're not required to get anything in writing until 24 hours later. There are 7 categories of use of restraint and seclusion that then would need to be reported to a superintendent. Those categories are death, injury, or hospitalization of staff or student results. Adult has used the restraint or seclusion 3 or more times on 1 or more students. A physical restraint was used more than 15 minutes. The student has experienced 3 or more restraints and seclusions in the school year. The student has experienced restraint and seclusion more than once in the school day. The student is not already on a behavior intervention plan, or the restraint or seclusion was used in violation of the rules. So those are the 7 categories that are supposed to then go and be reported to the superintendent. That is a very inconsistent practice, and there's not oversight of it. So we see frequently that superintendents, until we get involved, are unaware that a child has been restrained 3 or 4 or 5 times. I will say the time I had a client who'd been restrained 63 times in 2 months, superintendent was aware of that, but the plans hadn't changed just because the child was being restrained multiple times every day. The only categories that are required to be reported to the Agency of Education are death or injury requiring outside medical treatment, that the student was restrained or secluded for more than 30 minutes, or the restraint or seclusion was used in violation of the rules. So one of the challenges with that last one, both in terms of superintendent reporting and agency reporting, is that not everyone's aware when they have violated the rules, right? They may very well think that the restraint or seclusion was done properly, but without a review process, there's no way to determine that and then do education and training to prevent that from happening again in the future. So our recommendation would be to significantly expand the data collection that the agency needs to do to include every restraint or seclusion, so that the agency can track this information, identify schools that are outliers in their use of restraint and seclusion, and then offer training and technical assistance to assist them in implementing other practices that will allow them to use less restraint and seclusion. I think that, there was a story in Digger last night or this morning about the number of districts that are currently in targeted monitoring, but that's about completing child find and transition plans in a timely way. It's not about restraint and seclusion. This to me is an even more serious risk of harm to students than not getting paperwork done exactly right or exactly timely. So that's a recommendation around data collection. I would also strongly encourage that if we expand data collection, that we do it to include protected class information so that we can see whether disproportionate use is not just on students with disabilities, but whether there's disproportionality with regard to race, gender, age, or status as an elementary, middle, or high school student, as well as eligibility for free and reduced lunch.
Is that federal law though, that we can't report under a certain number?
So there are rules around data suppression. So everything can be reported. What can then be publicly provided? It may be that numbers would be data suppressed at the school level, but perhaps not at the district or supervisory union level, and certainly not at the state level. And some of this data is, as I said before, reported to the Office of Civil Rights, U.S. Department of Education, but the data lag is tremendous, right? We're in 2023, and the most recently available data that they have public is 2017, 2018, right? So I think if we can do data collection at the state level, we will be able to more timely respond and help students, families, and schools have access to what they need to not be engaged in these practices.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. So my second recommendation is about adding to 409 a complaint and investigation process. Right now, 4500 only provides for internal investigation after a complaint to a building's administrator. And although the rule does allow for the use of the dispute resolution provisions of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to be used, what we have seen is pretty significant inconsistency in using the state complaint process to actually investigate restraints and seclusions. And at least in one case, that because there was not an allegation that FAPE was denied, just declining to do so. And so no action was taken. We've also seen that at the state level, our Human Rights Commission is overwhelmed with complaints, and so have asked us to refer school-based complaints to the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. The U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights received 19,000 discrimination complaints last year alone, and they have a significant backlog as a result of that. So families that we have assisted in filing complaints with OCR have been waiting well over a year for their investigations to even begin. These are not means of resolving disputes over restraint and seclusion. So what our recommendation would be is to either expand the state complaint process that already exists for students with disabilities to include investigating restraint and seclusion, or to create an independent investigation process outside of the school itself. It's awfully hard to have schools investigating themselves about whether they made a mistake or not. And again, I don't think the issue here is necessarily punishing a school so much as making schools that have made errors in use of restraint and seclusion aware and giving training and technical assistance, and then doing repair with the student who was harmed. Next up, training. I think H409 needs a training element. And I think there are a couple of ways that we can do this. One is to create AOE permanent state level staffing to oversee alignment of initiatives that have to do with improving school climate, including restraint and seclusion. And then the second is to provide some trainings over this coming summer through the agency or through contractors on de-escalation and student safety, especially for any agencies that are currently using agencies or LEAs that are using prone restraints. There's one particular model of training for restraint and seclusion that uses prone restraint. And I do think if we can eliminate prone restraints, that districts that still use that model or their contractors would really benefit from training from a different model. The BEST program at CDCI has CPI trained trainers. They already have, I think, 4 kind of professional development trainings planned over the school year, and I think would be open to doing more if that is needed in order to take steps forward with reducing the use of restraint and seclusion. And then last, in addition to data collection, I think we need more data monitoring and oversight. One of the things that I've talked about with my colleagues at the Principals and Superintendents Associations is potentially the creation of a training and data council to provide some of that oversight, to be able to use this expanded data collection that I'm recommending, to identify those schools who need additional monitoring and training and support, as well as coaching. And to have an entity within the state that really is focused on this and this specifically. So that gets me to the end of my 30 minutes on restraint and seclusion. And I know we want to move on to behavioral threat assessments, but before I do, I'll just
I'd like to see if anybody's got questions.
get questions.
What you're saying in general is that 4,500 and 409 have lots of overlap.
Yes.
That maybe, 4,500 pretty much addresses all of it, but 4,500 guarantees nothing because without
There's not,
training and oversight and
there's no enforcement mechanism. Yes, yeah.
And then you've got, I think, some really well thought out recommendations as we move forward, lots of which is based on data collecting, dealing with outside folks like police coming in.
Yep.
And of course, expanded training and targeting of that training toward districts that the data shows need more assistance.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful.
And to be clear, the pieces where I know that we've got some agreement on are the prone restraint piece, the training piece, the data collection piece, and the data council piece. Those are all elements that I think you're going to hear from the V's as well, that makes a lot of sense to them too, to make those changes.
Further questions before we switch topics? Go right ahead. Question?
Yeah. So you're talking about students with disabilities that are probably most likely on a 504 or an IEP plan. In those plans, is there a plan for when a student is becoming unregulated and what the prevention and intervention way before a restraint, and are those being followed with fidelity?
Those are really good questions. More?
Just because, the disability is not being able to regulate, in general.
Often, yes.
Often with
Yes.
these students. And so, I guess hopefully a psychologist or a psychiatrist has been involved in that planning, and that teachers and parents and administration understand what needs to happen when the student starts becoming unregulated.
Yeah. So I would say it varies. That yes, some districts and some schools do have behavior intervention plans in a student's IEP or 504. Others will make a reference to the behavior intervention plan or 504, but keep it as a separate document. And then others simply do not have a behavior intervention plan. The child that I talked about who the parent disenrolled and then because of seclusions and then enrolled again the next year, they had no behavior intervention plan that first year. In those first couple months, when they re-enrolled, it took from September to December before a behavior intervention plan was even written, right? And then followed with fidelity. I think that's the next part of your question. Again, I think it varies, right? So in some places, yeah, you've got great staff who understand the student, understand the plan, can put that together and follow it with fidelity. And then you've got a student who comes in and there's a sub. And they have no idea what the plan is, and they've never trained on it. And the day goes terribly. And the alternative that some schools have taken is to say, how about you keep your kid home on that day? Well, that's not really an alternative because then they have no access to education, right? So, we're in a tough spot staffing wise. You've heard that all year long and last year and the year before and the year before. But a big piece of this is not just staffing, but staffing and redundancy of training. So that if the normal teacher is sick, there's somebody in there who also knows the student and the student's plan and has those skills to do de-escalation if that's what happens. And let's be honest, when there's an unexpected change, like there's a sub in the room, that's potentially something that could trigger some dysregulation because something has changed and we are creatures of habit and we like things to stay the same, right? Whether we have disabilities or not. So I hope that answers your question. I hate having to answer it depends, but it depends. Yeah.
Well, I assume that even the most well thought out plan is out the window sometimes in the heat of the moment, and especially when you
It can be.
Substitute and a small school that probably may not have another adult available.
Yeah.
To intervene.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. That was very informative.
Absolutely. And I do have some proposed language if you'd like that as
I
well.
haven't written here, any suggestions I should send along.
Will
And, this is not a bill we'll probably get out at the end of this year.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect that, given that we're significantly past crossover, I imagine we have a little bit of time the rest of this year.
Even out of this committee, we'll probably continue to take more time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's move on to S-138, a bill that you received from your Senate counterparts. I want to start by saying that we absolutely support the need for school safety and prevention of catastrophic events at schools. This is critically important. But public safety for kids who are brown and black is different than what it looks like for white kids. And the use of law enforcement to ensure public safety often equates to harm or death for members of Black and brown communities and communities of people with disabilities. So one of the things that has kind of developed over these many, many years now of gun violence in schools, of bomb threats, of these other kind of school-wide threat issues, is this concept of threat assessment. And while in theory it makes sense, what we have seen across the country is that as actually implemented, it encourages school administrators and other staff to see students as dangers to the school rather than valued community members and children who are worthy of protection. That othering is perhaps even more likely to make those students feel like they don't belong in their schools. So what we see in section 1485 of S-138, we certainly appreciate the changes that the Senate made before they passed it over to you. So it no longer requires that districts have these threat assessment teams. It no longer defines that they must have specific members, including a law enforcement officer. And it does expand the data collection that is required of districts if they are going to have these teams, including some of that demographic data collection that I also recommend around restraints or seclusions. So we see those as improvements. But we still have concerns with this bill. It still does not define behavior threat assessment and leaves that to guidance. It still does not define what counts as a behavior threat. It does not identify the purpose of a threat assessment or describe the scope of authority of a threat assessment team, other than to say that it doesn't have the power to do exclusionary discipline. Another type of team that our schools have that we absolutely support are school safety committees. These are looking more at a systems level rather than an individual student and targeting the individual student. We have no problem with school safety committees. But what we see with threat assessments is first a lack of evidence that they actually accurately predict threats and prevent threats from being carried out. We just haven't seen that data from those who've put this proposal forward. We've seen in other places that this puts law enforcement in a student's life for what really maybe ought to be mundane discipline situations. And so you're replacing law enforcement with trained educators. We've really been working hard to have less police presence in school, especially when it comes to disciplinary matters. And these teams can and do in other places, and quite frankly here, and I have a story I'll tell you in a moment, do an end run around the legal and civil rights of students who are placed in this threat assessment process. It's a way of suspending students off the books and without due process. Even if a student is not found to be a threat, the fact of having done an assessment can remain on the record. It can lead to intrusion into the children's and the family's private lives. It can be a financial burden to secure a risk assessment and take time off to get the child to and from the assessment. And it can disrupt the education access during the assessment process. We had a student who was too young under Act 35 to be suspended, but they were determined to be a risk, or they were determined to need a risk assessment. And so they were taken out of school. The parents had to take time off for work. They went, they got a risk assessment. They said, the child was said, you're not a risk, you can go back to school. The school said, no, we want a risk assessment by our risk assessor. So then they had to wait a month and a half to get the second risk assessment. No access to school, minimal tutoring during that time. Parents had to take significant time off of work in order to be home with their child who was not allowed at school. And during none of that process was the child ever given a hearing on suspension or expulsion because the school wasn't viewing it as disciplinary, even though the effect is the same. And I think this is a kind of a trend that we see is the intent doesn't necessarily matter in terms of why a child is restrained or secluded. The effect is the same. The intent doesn't matter as to why a child is excluded from school. The result is the same. Being subject to these assessments can also lead to inappropriate information sharing with law enforcement, unfairly labeling and stigmatizing students with long-term consequences in their education and beyond. It can compound trauma. It can drain resources, and it can lead to mission creep from seeking to prevent serious threats to over-policing of disability-related behavior. And I'm not saying these things theoretically. This is what we've seen across the country with the use of these teams. Slide 21 of the slide deck that I gave you gives you a landscape of current school removals. And I put in quite a bit of information here on the school discipline process and school removals, because I think it really is not actually a separate discussion from threat assessments. What you'll see here is that the most recent data available.
Just stopping for a quick second.
Yep.
Is that in the same slide deck that we were looking at?
Yep, same slide deck. I put both bills into the same slide deck. You'll see here that threat or intimidation was the reason for 278 of the suspensions that occurred in the most recent data collection. And school conduct violation was kind of the broad and kind of not super useful category because there's so many potential school conduct violations. 3,294 of the suspensions were in that category. We also see some disproportionality in exclusionary discipline. You're much more likely to be suspended for disorderly conduct or threat or intimidation if you are receiving free or reduced lunch. 69% of the disorderly conduct suspensions were children who received free or reduced lunch. 71% of the threat or intimidation suspensions were for students who received free or reduced lunch. And students with disabilities as well are much more likely to be removed from school for this conduct. Again, students with disabilities, about 20% of the school population, 50.66% of suspensions that were less than 5 days. So 2.5 times their overall representation in the school population. And they made up a combination between 504 and IEP students, 60.4% of students who are removed from school for threat or intimidation. So we already have processes in place that remove students from school if they are making threats. It is the school discipline process, and it provides extra protections to students with disabilities, including what's called the manifestation determination review process. I'm seeing some heads nod that you're familiar with that process. So the requirement under Rule 4300 is that students with disabilities, if they are being suspended for 10 consecutive days or 10 cumulative days during the school year, need to have a manifestation determination review. It's required at that point to look at whether the behavior is disability-related behavior. And if it is, you have to address the behavior and you cannot proceed with the discipline. It's not required at less than 10 days, but I think that another change that we could make to avoid exclusionary discipline and address threats, if that's our goal here, is to say, let's do manifestation determination review at the time of the threat and say, is this because of their disability? If so, what do we need to be doing differently? Let's get the team together. Let's look at this IEP or this 504 plan. Let's look at, do they have a behavior intervention plan? And if they do, does it need to be changed? Do we need to do a new functional behavioral assessment to understand where is this behavior coming from and what can we do to prevent it, right? These are students who are still learning how to interact with others and regulate their emotions. And so these need to be teaching opportunities, not punishment. And again, like restraint and seclusion, we don't have evidence that exclusion from school is going to correct behavior. It just doesn't exist.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second, just sort of
Yes.
what you just said. I think, it often boils down to timing and personnel.
Yeah.
So, you say, well, instead, let's get together everybody and have a meeting. That could take days when a threat might be immediate. So how do you sort of address it?
Yep. So if we move along in the slides, you will see that Rule 4311 already provides the option, if there is an immediate threat to self, others, property, or educational environment, for immediate removal before hearing until such hearing can occur. And gives schools the authority to take whatever action is appropriate under the circumstances, including immediate suspension, pending a hearing as soon as possible thereafter. And one of the things that we sometimes see is, even if it's possible to do a hearing the next day, a school will say, I think everybody needs some time to cool down. Let's wait 5 days. That's not as soon as possible thereafter. So there's a practice challenge here as well. If there's a weapon involved in the threat, there is a requirement to refer to law enforcement and to actually expel the student for the rest of the year, the calendar year, unless a special circumstance applies. And those special circumstances are the child was not aware that they had brought a weapon, They had no intent to use the weapon to threaten or endanger others. They have a disability and their misconduct is related to the disability, or they do not present an ongoing threat to others, and a lengthy expulsion would not serve the interests of the student. So those are the 4 reasons to not do that full year expulsion. If you go back up to the data that I shared with you, there were, 48 weapons possessions suspensions in that data set. There were 0 homicide, kidnapping, stalking, or trespassing suspensions. And data was suppressed, which means that the numbers were low enough that it could be identifiable in the area of school threat, fire alarm, or other. So there were some number of those, but a small enough number that it couldn't be reported. So there is, again, I think the point that I'm trying to make is there is already a process to immediately address an immediate threat without having to add this layer of behavioral threat assessment teams that can and do circumvent that due process. Talked about manifestation determination review. Okay, one other note that I want to make on this is this question of, well, what is a threat, right? So for Rule 4500 that we just talked about, you can only physically restrain a student when they present an imminent and substantial risk of bodily harm to the student or others. And substantial risk means an imminent threat of bodily harm where there is an ability to enact such harm. And this only exists when all other less restrictive alternatives to diffuse the situation have been exhausted or failed, or the level of risk prohibits exhausting other means. So we have a pretty specific standard for when you can restrain a student for threat, but this proposal in S-138 has no definition of what is a threat and what counts and when these teams would come into play. And I think that vagueness is a real problem and would really lead to some mission creep. The bill also doesn't do what Rule 4500 does, which says you got to take the student's characteristics into account. How severe is the behavior? What's their age? What's their chronological and developmental age? What's their physical size? What's their ability to communicate? What's their cognitive ability? And do they have any known physical, psychiatric conditions, personal history of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse or trauma? Those are all factors we take into consideration before we restrain or seclude a child. And I think if these teams are going to exist, those are also factors that need to be considered before we say we're going to do this threat assessment, rather than use the existing processes that we have in school discipline and in the IDEA to assess a student and provide the services and supports to meet their needs. I would really like us to be focusing more on how do we meet the needs? How do we make sure students feel safe and included in school? Because to me, that's the way that we prevent threats from happening, is that we have students who feel safe and included in school, not ostracized, and so that they, want to bring a weapon to school to get back at someone who's been bullying and harassing them all year.
Fair to say, though, that there's almost a purpose behind having a vagueness in the definition of what a threat is, because it could be a student who's not sort of identified in any way, but has some social media postings that might be troublesome. And if that's sort of not part of the definition of a threat, then I think, we're living in a different world. I think we can look at school shootings for the last 30 years and say something has to be done.
Yep.
And that threats exist, and that identifying them early hopefully could make a difference. I think what you're telling me is there's no data to support that.
I would love to see it if it exists. I have not found any. No one's provided me any.
But I guess I do think that we're not talking about here about, a kid in school making, dysregulated and making threats. We also could be talking about a student who's not necessarily identified as somebody who might be on the front burner of making a threat, but rather there's something going on in the background that somebody has identified. Maybe they called the school and said, hey, I just saw this on Facebook or whatever.
Yeah, and I think then the question is, what happens if you see that on Facebook, but that's not even a violation of the school conduct code? How do you exclude someone from school pending a threat assessment if they haven't actually done something that violates your school conduct rules?
But threat assessment and exclusion aren't necessarily joined at the hip.
I have not seen a situation where a student's allowed to stay in school pending a threat assessment.
And then a threat assessment is different than a risk assessment.
I've seen them used interchangeably.
I know risk assessment is an actual thing defined that because we've had to use it with
Yeah.
kids who are done to school.
Yeah.
Representative Austin?
So I totally agree with you about the child protection team. But I think with prevention, for me, it's hard to prove that a prevention, anything works, because if you're preventing it, it doesn't happen. And one of the things I think about Vermont schools, and maybe this is naive, but we haven't, I feel like with child protection team, the team that's made up of the teachers and administrator and guidance and parents, and sometimes the student, that's working in terms of trying to figure out what's going on with the student that we might even consider that they're a threat. The question I have is, there's also a connection to DCF, right? In terms of if you as a teacher are
Mandated reporting.
You're mandated to report it. So usually and hopefully it's with the child protection team's blessing that, yes, we think this is a reportable offense. Is that like a stopgap measure in order to prevent? I don't like the behavior of the threat assessment because I don't think we're skilled or trained or we don't have the expertise to do that. There are people that do that we can bring in, but
Yeah, I mean, I think the child protection system through DCF is an important part of our system, whether it's because someone thinks the child is a threat or because the child has experienced harm, right? I see that as really separate from this proposal of behavioral threat assessment teams. And I don't see this proposal as impacting at all what mandated reporters are mandated to report, right? So I do think that's a system that's been in place. I think that's a system for all its strengths and weaknesses that has generally been more helpful than not helpful. And I also think that the Act 264 teams, right, that the coordinated services program teams that can come together, not just from the education side, but designated agency staff, DCF staff, medical folks come together to say, what does this child need, not just in school, but services kind of wrapped around them. I think that's another team that can say, like, what are the struggles here? What are the behaviors that we're seeing? And how can we help this child to not have those behaviors anymore? And to me, that's the lens of how do we help these children have what they need so they can grow up, finish high school, go to college, get jobs, be independent in their living. And I think when you're treated as a threat by your school, that's a badge that does not go away. It just doesn't.
We have a short amount of time, so here's what I'm going to ask you to do, and then we have a very packed agenda today, so I can't really let this extend. I'm sort of finish up, but then with what you want to say about sort of issues, and then we will have you back to talk about proposed language changes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to skip through some challenges that I think already exist with implementation of the due process requirements of 4300 that I think could also be a part of not really needing threat assessment teams if we can do school discipline proceedings better. I do think, some of the recommendations that I have for you are around defining behavioral threat when a manifestation determination is the appropriate thing to do, expanding when those get used. And then again, data collection. And we do have that improved in what you got from the Senate. But really also using that data, not just for collection purposes, but then also what does this mean in terms of the training and technical assistance that go back out to schools to improve school climate? I think that really is key. Goes back to a recommendation I had earlier, creating state level staffing on safe and inclusive school environment practices, right? So just as restraint seclusion is something that those state level staff could be working on. Positive behavior interventions and supports, restorative approaches, social emotional learning, trauma informed schools, having that expertise at the agency level for schools to be able to rely on in a more intense way than is currently available. I think that's another really key approach to making sure our schools are safe. One of the recommendations of the Act 35 Committee on Safe and Inclusive Schools was to create a state interagency committee that would bring together the AHS folks and the AOE folks. And I think that also makes a ton of sense. Again, funding for educator training, right? Educators are asked to do a ton, and we need to make sure that they have the funding to be trained to do all of these things that are not just classroom management and teaching. And I also think, and I gave this short shift, so I'll talk about this when I come back, improving our response to hazing, harassment, and bullying. I think that goes a long way to preventing the threats from arising, is really doing better on dealing with hazing, harassment, and bullying. So that's what I've got for you today. I appreciate a whole hour of your time on a really busy schedule.
I apologize if we only gave you a half an hour on each. We can go an hour on both, no problem.
Easily, absolutely. But I do look forward to coming back and talking with you all.
Appreciate your availability and
Absolutely.
flexibility.
Thank you so much.
All right, on to 10 o'clock, Universal Pre-K. We have testimony from the Vermont Principals Association and the Vermont Superintendents Association. And I'll let you folks figure out who's speaking and who's going first or second, or however you want to handle it. Yeah, please.
For the record, Jay Nichols, Executive Director of Vermont Principals Association. I'd like to point out that Rachel took some of my time, and I wanted to put that on the record. And thank you for making sure our Representative Tooth was here when I actually had to ask.
We held back.
Yeah, thanks. So my purpose today is to testify on H2A. And so my comments will be focused primarily on the issue of 4-year-olds in public schools, because that's the area that we have expertise in at the VPA. In full disclosure, the VPA has the position, and it's had a position for the last 5 or 6 years, that calls for all 4-year-olds to have the option to be in public schools for full day, full week, full school year service. We've heard from the very strong private early childhood education providers in the lobby that they want to keep the same hybrid mixed delivery system that is in place currently. To be fair, there have been some positives with the hybrid system, at least for some parents. And we are not calling for an end to what is done at the 0 to 3-year-old level. In fact, we think parents should have choice at the 4-year-old level as well. In the current delivery model, there are some issues with quality right now with 2 sets of rules. For example, in public schools, instruction is delivered by high-quality licensed teachers. In private programs, the instruction is often not delivered by high-quality licensed teachers. And although a qualified licensed teacher does have to deliver the instruction, they do not have to actually, they don't deliver the instruction, they do have to be on site. Some cases they might deliver it, some cases they might not. This is akin to Representative Brady teaching her class versus her leaving lesson plans with a substitute or a paraeducator who may or may not be qualified, and she may be someplace else in the building. Doesn't really help the kids if she's in the copy room making copies. Of course, our research clearly demonstrates the importance of having a licensed teacher working with students. That is indisputable. Those private programs that actually have a licensed teacher who is actually providing the developmentally appropriate instructional experiences for students can be of a very high quality. I even have one grandkid that goes to one. What we do know is that we have many 4-year-old students in Vermont right now that do not receive high quality programming from licensed teachers. We have places where there are literally no private programs available. We also have places that receive public money, but don't actually provide instructional strategies from licensed teachers. We in Vermont could move all of our 4-year-old students into public schools in the next few years and provide all 4-year-olds with high quality, full day, full week, full year program that is optional for parents and students, but schools will be required to provide, just like we did kindergarten 3 decades ago. This is something that was started in Oklahoma in the late 1990s to great success. It's interesting that Oklahoma, a state with a long history of underfunding education, has this available for all parents and students for free, and we don't in Vermont, a state that prides itself on equity. I think we all agree that 10 hours of dosage is not enough. I've never heard of a person who had any expertise in early childhood say that 10 hours of dosage was enough. I've never heard anyone say that. Dosage matters. Licensed teachers matter, at least for 4-year-olds. Babysitting doesn't deliver the quality we need, and for many students, that is essentially what they get. And they may be students that are not in any kind of program. It might be with their grandparents, it might be with a stay-at-home parent, so we have those situations too. This is not a knock on any program, just representative of the fact that many students do not have any other options because of limited travel, affordability of the private care facility, hours of the public school option, parents' work schedule, etc. We can't fix every issue, but we can dramatically improve access and dosage for the vast majority of 4-year-old students in the state of Vermont. Doing this alone would be a boost to reading and math scores, students' ability to regulate, allow for trained professionals to have quicker and more extended access to students with challenges, would improve all student outcomes, including graduation rates, likelihood of going to college or pursuing some other certificate or degree program beyond high school graduation. We've seen these results in other states, and we've seen them in other countries. France has been doing this for as long as I've been around. Additionally, many current school districts are already providing full-day programming. However, they are facing a tax disincentive for doing that. Schools are not fully compensated for pre-K students for a full day, even when they run a full-day program. The potential result of that funding issue is that some of our poorest districts that are providing full-day programming only to get to count the students in terms of per pupil funding ADM as 0.43 students instead of 1.0 students. At the very least, the legislature this year should fully fund ADM for pre-K students the same as they do for K-5 students for school districts that are providing the full day, full week, full year program. It's important to realize in the Senate, I was told this was going to cost $13-15 million. And I said, that's interesting because my math says it will cost $0.00. We're already paying for this. It's already in schools' budgets. It's a question about fairness and not having our poorest communities have to subsidize extra in places that don't have any other options. If you're committed to keeping the current system that definitely works well for some families as a subsidy from the education fund, that's completely up to the committee. But please at least fund the school districts that are taking it upon themselves to do the right thing for the 4-year-olds and their talents that simply don't have other options. A final concern of mine is that for many, the purpose of the hybrid system and the whole 10-hour model is to use 3- and 4-year-olds to prop up a private business model that isn't fiscally sustainable on its own. It seems like the legislature is going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars into that childcare system. And I have no problem with that. That's a policy decision. It's a legitimate policy decision and a resources discussion. However, you have thousands of 4-year-olds in Vermont that are getting no or minimal service that could be addressed immediately. There are many excuses of why you should not put 4-year-olds in school. I'll address some of those here. Schools would be too crowded. We had 120,000 kids in 1997. We have 80,000 kids now. We have room overall. And we also have tuitioning options. Schools already do that, as you know, from all the conversations you've had in this committee this year. Buses, same issue. Buses will be too crowded, same issue as above. 4-year-olds are too young to ride in the bus. We have a whole bunch of 4-year-olds that are already riding on the bus every day to and from school in these full day programs. It's already happening with no extra issues. 4-year-olds model for 3-year-olds. I heard those comments. That's true. But 4-year-olds on waiting lists or in places with no private programs and no full day public program are left behind depending on the schedule of the parents and the ability to transport those children. It's hard to be a model or see other student models if you can't get access to the program in the first place, which happens for far too many kids right now in Vermont. Public schools are not allowed to have waiting lists. We serve all kids. When we pushed for kindergarten in all public schools, we heard a lot of the same arguments we're hearing now. The bottom line is if we want to improve our schools and student learning, now is the time to actually take bold action that will also help the state economically and will be beneficial to thousands of students and many families that right now have poor or limited options, at least for their 4-year-olds. The amount of money being put into the private child care programs without all 4-year-olds being fully the responsibility of the parent trying to figure out would be better spent by using those extra millions of dollars to A, support 0 to 3, And B, provide additional support to families for after-school and summer programming for all students. And one more time, if you're not going to move in this direction, at least provide full ADM funding for full day, full school year, full week programs that are already doing this. None of the arguments you have heard from the backers of the status quo has anything to do with providing our poorest school districts with appropriate levels of ADM. Superintendents and business managers can speak to this impact that this would have on a positive way in their systems. And in fact, they were lined up to speak in Senate Ed, and then their testimony was canceled. Subject to any questions, that's my testimony. Thank you.
All right, let's open up to questions. Representative McCann.
Hi, thanks for that. My question is around supervision and evaluation and whether or not principals have the time to do an adequate job now with the teachers they have in their building. And then what would it add if you were to bring in the 4-year-olds?
I think that's a fair question. There's some places that already do that, and that is a question is an issue across the board in the United States. I do a lot of presentations and trainings on supervision and evaluation. So I will tell you that right now in the K-12 system in the United States, it's pretty poor in a lot of places, and we're no exception to that. But I would also say that in the programs that are out there now, there's not anybody on site necessarily that's a licensed person, that's a trained educator that might be observing the person actually giving the instruction. So your question is very valid, but it's also valid K through 12. What can we do to free up more time for our school leaders and take away administrivia so they can actually serve as instructional leaders? That's really what the answer is. And you had Paul Manna come in here to this legislature like in 2011 or 12, and he basically said, start taking stuff off the plates of principals and teachers and only have them do the stuff that relates to instruction and give them the support they need. That actually is the answer.
Representative Austin.
Yep. When you say full year, you're talking about the school year.
I say full school year, I hope.
Oh, okay. I thought you said full year. So, okay, just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know the percent of private schools that serve 3 and 4-year-olds that are implementing bells?
I have no idea. I do know that.
I think it's fair to say that if you qualify to receive the current subsidy or the voucher, whatever you want to call it, for 4-year-olds, you have
Should
to
assume
have
that is
bells.
implemented.
And that currently 60% of 4-year-olds, or maybe it's 3 and 4-year-olds, are in a private program.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I believe by the data that was shared by Building Bright Futures, there's something like 52% of the 4-year-olds are getting like minimal or no service.
Okay. And just one other question. What would you think of doing, let's say, a multi-age for kindergarten, 4-year-olds in a kindergarten?
I think that's a local decision. As a principal, I had multi-age. I found that it was very effective. We had it in 3-4. I think I had it 1, 2, 3, 4 when I was principal at Bakersfield. We struggled with it in math. And so we ended up going to a grade level model in math. Mm-hmm. Just something about mathematics is really difficult for the teachers, more so than the students in some ways.
Oh, that makes sense.
But then everything else, the 6 years that I was there before I went to South Burlington and then Superintendent of Essex, we did have that model. One thing I like about that model is that the older kids do get the model for the younger kids. Mm-hmm. So it's less time spent on the re-instruction, and the teacher gets a 2-year relationship with the kids, which I really think it's very valuable. And research supports that, having teachers go a couple years with the same set of kids, especially at the elementary level.
Representative Brady.
What's the ideal sort of path towards this and the schedule? If our goal is to say that we want to have all 4-year-olds have access to full day pre-K in their public school, the wait is huge. Is that the biggest sort of policy lever in moving us towards that? What other steps will it take to move us towards it? Because we hear concerns around, and I know some of them exist in my community.
Yeah.
Literally space.
Yeah.
Workforce and teachers, some of the after school programming and whether those are going to have different regulations and whether they could take 4-year-olds. So what else are the kind of practical steps along the way, either legislatively or in the field, to move us there? And what realistically do you see as the sort of time frame that it takes?
Well, when we first talked about this at the VPA my first year, one of the things I said to them, full disclosure, is actually said it in my interview, that I think we should have 4-year-olds in public schools, and I think it should be a goal of the states to do that. And I was thinking it's something we should be able to get done in the next decade. And then we had COVID. And so I'm just so worried about all those 0, 1, 2-year-olds that got very little during that situation because people couldn't give them the social experiences that they need. And really good preschools, it's all about vocabulary development, in my opinion, vocabulary development, play-based, developmentally appropriate, where kids are really working with each other on learning social skills. Once kids can do that and can regulate themselves, they're much more likely to learn. So with that precursor, I think the levers are, yes, on the full day ADM, pay schools for the amount of time they're providing instruction to kids. It's their local budget, give them support like you would K through 12. And secondly, I think we should have a law that says schools have to offer it. And if you can't offer it, what do you have to do? Well, then you've got to tuition your students at that grade level. And I would give an on-ramp of a couple of years for schools to make that happen. That's my personal opinion.
I think there is a real Chittenden County issue here in that Williston.
True.
Burlington, there's just no space.
Yeah, true. But that's not the rest of the state.
Right.
Not even close. And in Chittenden County, parents can get private. Yeah, you do, but you also have services. Other than Winooski, all your towns have services. You've got private programs that are high functioning. Other places have, it's not that they're not high functioning, it's that they do not exist. They're deserts of childcare, lack of childcare out there. And those kids are getting nothing.
But in my district, we're 80% private.
Yeah.
We operated.
Yeah.
And so that transition would be a major transition, highly disruptive. So would you support a system that would allow a district to contract with, to fulfill their full day, full school year, 4-year-old obligation that they could contract with a private provider or several private providers if they don't have the capacity?
The bottom line for me would be a licensed teacher. And the first thing I would look at is public schools nearby. But I think we made a big mistake in Act 166, and I was a supporter of that because I thought that would open the door to get kids what they need. And I think we made a big mistake by saying, if you're public school, you have to have an actual teacher. If you're not a public school, you don't have to. So if we're not going to have the delivery being done by not by a public school teacher, by a licensed teacher doing the actual instruction of the kids, to me, that is the bottom line. That's the line of demarcation for me personally. It's got to be a licensed teacher. Otherwise, it's not appropriate, and it's not, there's no research that supports that really making a difference.
How do we handle absolute school deserts such as the Kingdom Choice District?
Yeah, I don't have a magic answer for that. I think there are options. If you said you had to provide it and it was a public school model, there might be the districts banding together to offer some type of public school model in a building that they might put together. I mean, I don't have an answer for that. I just think if we're going to start the ball rolling, the first thing we should do at least is say, we're going to let you have the money that you should rightfully have by giving the ADM. And then I would look at a timeline on how you would fully implement 4-year-olds in school, should that be the desire of the General Assembly over time.
What about helping districts get there? Additional funding or, because they're going to hire, they're going to have to perhaps revamp facilities in order to accommodate 4-year-olds, age-appropriate playground, whatever it happens to be. Or maybe they say, we're going to close this little school and we're going to turn that on fully 4-year-old.
Right. There will be some of that, I'm sure.
Yeah. I guess but that all comes with some significant financial costs. Yes, with the eventual being able to have a count of one for each of those students. But getting to that, it seems to me might be a significant financial barrier.
I don't think there would be any people in public education that would turn away any money the General Assembly offered to try to help with that. And if you take the PCBs completely off the place so our schools don't have to close because of PCBs, that would help too.
Representative Williams.
Yes, thanks. Would you support pre-K, 4-year-olds or whatever, going across the river up in the kingdom where there aren't any public schools to get their education in a public setting in New Hampshire?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
To be.
With a licensed teacher.
Right, and to have it paid for by the state of Vermont.
I'd have to think about that. I really would. I mean, I hadn't even thought about that. But I think the fact that it's a licensed teacher is a step in the right direction for sure. I'm not prepared to really comment more on that. I have not talked to my board about that. But I like the thought behind it, having it be a licensed teacher in a public school. off the top of my head, it sounds like something we should consider for sure.
Right, because as you know, I mean,
I know your area well.
Options are pretty-
I know. I know that area very well.
However, I will point out that neighboring schools
Right, those,
have lots of capacity.
that's true.
So, you know, there are a lot of kids are already attending.
neighboring dollars.
Yeah, neighboring.
It's a relative term.
And the same issue is probably down along the Massachusetts border. It's some of these
Right,
very
right.
remote mountain towns.
Yeah.
Before we release you, Jeff, were you also going to speak? Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Morning. For the record, I'm Jeff Francis, the Executive Director for the Vermont Superintendent's Association. I didn't prepare written remarks because I was trying to figure out as late as an hour ago what it was that I was going to say. I knew that, that Jay was going to do a good job from the perspective of the VPA and his perspective. I think it might be useful if I start by saying that in terms of the pre-K policy arena, as it relates to the early care and education system in Vermont, VSA, for all intents and purposes, took a hiatus from the delving into the really thorny public policy issues about 4 years ago. And that happened because since the enactment of 166, the association had seen areas of improvement that we frankly weren't able to make any headway on. And I think the reason that we weren't able to make headway on it has to do with the joint agency administration and oversight, and the fact that the early care side of the delivery system really has dominated the public policy arena. I think that's indisputable. And it made it hard, frankly, for us to get a word in edgewise when we, as you know, from working with the respective education associations, are pretty effective at getting a word in edgewise. In 2018, what we referred to at the time as the Education Legislative Collaborative met in November in preparation for the 2019 legislative session. And we outlined a series of problem statements that we thought had either existed since the enactment of 166 or had persisted since days even before that. And I want to pause here and say that when Act 166 was being deliberated and enacted, the Superintendent's Association, I think, was probably at the top of the organizational list in terms of support. We believe in universal access to pre-K. And I also think that a mixed delivery system is good public policy for reasons of capacity, for continuity in a child's learning experience, because it's really a societal interest that we should all respond to. You know, people talk about cradle to career, and I think that that really is a good philosophy. The problem statements that we identified, I would say in many ways have still gone unresponded to. One is equitable access, not only for children with special needs, but all children, based on the availability of early pre-K settings that I think, you know, there's data on. I don't have it, but it persists as a problem across the state. The issue of educational equity for education, pre-K education that's provided in different types of settings still hasn't been resolved. So, for example, as Jay indicated, in public schools, there's a requirement that for pre-K, direct instruction be provided by a licensed teacher at all times. In private centers, as Jay indicated, you just need to have a licensed teacher on site. And for home providers, it's a consultation model. So these are all settings where public dollars are being provided to support the education. On top of that, we saw problems with the 10 hours as inherently inequitable because so many wraparound services in a care education setting are necessitated that you have to have folks in many instances who can pay for care in order to access the education. So that was problematic. And it was, something that we wanted to turn into. We also knew, and this is borne out by other testimony that you've had, that 10 hours of pre-K access is really not sufficient to address the achievement gap. So that was problematic. We noted that with the blended delivery model, some in public schools, some in a variety of early education and care settings, was really no pursuit. And I'm not suggesting that there should be a pursuit, but there was not really a pursuit of economy of scale. I think that the economy of scale argument came in the origins of S56 and H208, when there was going to be a reliance on 4-year-olds in public schools as a way, I thought, to sort of improve the overall efficiency and financial picture, which hasn't played out that way, and I'll come back to that. And then, it was really just in terms of the overall delivery system, were we able to get the services to the neediest kids. The pervasive problems at the time, this is 2018, in terms of accounts from local school district officials about the dual system oversight, and there's been a lot written on this. And then frankly, to go back to the way I opened up, when we tried to get a headway, sort of a handle on these issues, it was really challenging because even in the advocacy community, you had those folks that were working with public schools, but you also have the advocacy community, which is the early care system, which I think, if it's not the most prominent in the building today, I think it arguably could be. And if you dispute that, then look outside later on. None of that do I lament. It was really just a way to explain why we have not been as engaged in that area of policy as we have some other areas concerning education. When what became Act 166 was being deliberated in the General Assembly, in the early meetings that I had with folks from the Agency of Human Services who were proponents of the bill, and the early care advocacy community who were proponents of the bill, as was the education side of the equation, there was a term that was used that caused me to sort of cock my head, which was draw down education fund dollars. And I think at the time Act 166 was passed, there was really two interests. One was better care and education opportunity for pre-K students, but also access to resources that were going to be utilized to shore up the early care system. And I think did happen. And when you consider Morgan Crossman's testimony from yesterday, it's, laden with concerns about the fiscal implications of both S56 and 208. I went through this carefully this morning. I think it could have been 1 page rather than 9 because thematically the points are all the same. But it is impressive to see that this is the nature of comments that came from the early care community when they were asked to respond to those bills. So nothing that I'm saying is intended to disparage anyone. I'm just looking at it sort of as a public policy predicament. When 56 and 208 came out, I got a call on the 3rd of February, maybe the 2nd of February, from Pete Hirschfeld, who did a story for VPR. And the title of the story was Lawmakers Lean on Public Schools to Solve Childcare Crunch. And I think Peter, who I've worked with over the years, was expecting me to sort of lament the fact that once again, we're going to drop societal issues at the doorstep of the school and ask them to be part of the solution. And that wasn't the reaction that I gave him. Number one, schools should be part of the solution to societal issues. Two, we were actually looking forward to the discussion. I felt that the sponsors of those bills, Representative Wood on this side and Senators Hardy and Lyons on the Senate side, were indicative of the fact that we were going to get probably substantive movement with regard to how we were going to deliver pre-K, but by extension, support the early care and education system. And what I did lament was the fact that it only took a couple of weeks before that aspect, the 4-year-olds in public schools, was off the table. And in the Senate, it came off the table with a really voluminous study that looks to me like maybe we don't want to go there in the first place. And the reason that I state it that way is if you take a look at the history of public education in the 2 decades or so that I've been associated with it, public schools have been asked to really rise to the occasion to contend with very complicated public policy issues that didn't have, a third of the questions asked that we're saying we're going to ask about moving 4-year-olds to public schools. And, some of those bills were Act 60, which upended the funding system, Act 77, which makes an effort to really extend learning opportunities, particularly into areas of multiple pathways, higher education, responding to the aspirations of every student, and so on and so forth. Act 46, which was monumental in consequence in terms of how we tried to improve the delivery system for efficiency and economy. Act 173, which we're still struggling with, and I think that nobody should really use as a model for how to do things quickly the right way. And now Act 127. So from my vantage point, when I looked at 4-year-olds moving to public schools, I'll echo what I heard from my 10-member board of trustees when we talked about it. Was one, they thought it was good education policy. Two, there's evidence that shows that the continuity in learning, starting with 4-year-olds, benefits them all the way down the line. And three, when called upon, schools are able to figure out how to get things done. So I don't think that sort of a long list of questions ought to be a deterrent from moving deliberately on the basis of the merits of the issue to a very, very serious consideration of having 4-year-olds in public schools. Now, that stated, I'm a realist, and in your discussion with Jay, you touched upon some of the questions, and they were the same questions that were brought forward when I talked about it with my 10-member board of trustees. Number one, not everybody was ready to go. Number two, there were space considerations. Three, there are physical concerns with regard to capacity. But without getting long-winded on that aspect of it, all of those things could be figured out. I think the real challenge is, will the General Assembly be allowed to, I would say, follow a continuous improvement model, which would have more kids in publicly funded settings, either private or public, with licensed teachers. And you asked Jay about the potential for maintaining a mixed delivery model where school districts could contract with private providers, utilizing what I would imagine would be certainly more than the tuition that's being paid now. My response to that is yes. I mean, we ought to be ingenious in the state in terms of taking the capacity we have and managing it to a better end. So, you could listen to me talk. I'm not going to persist here. And maybe somebody would challenge anything I'm saying, is being largely theoretical. I was pleased to see that you apparently yesterday, and I'm sorry that I missed this, watched Sherry Souza's testimony. So if I hadn't known that you were going to have heard from Sherry Souza, I would have been making the point she made, because she is a scholar in terms of academic matters, particularly those associated with children with special needs, and I would say younger children as well. She talked about what they have accomplished down in the Windsor Central Supervisory Union. They've done it without the benefit of full ADM like we provide to school districts for kindergarten for a 10-hour program, even though nobody runs 10-hour programs. That's a little known provision of the law. And she also was able to show, and I realize that this is a sort of a localized issue in many, many ways, that they did it with no harm to the private delivery system. There's been an expansion down there. They figured it out. One of the principles of Act 166 was supposed to have been stronger school district connection with the private providers. I think that turned out in some places, but not in others. It ought to be the model in every place. But I have a hard time from my vantage point, which I think is maybe reflective of what I'd refer to as constructive bias, believing that if we, as a matter of public policy, said over some time we were going to move 4-year-olds into public schools, that we couldn't do it and do it well. As Jay pointed out, in the meantime, in a state where we're interested in equity period, advancing opportunity, and making sure that we've got our so-called tax capacity in balance, I think it would be very wise and very welcome if the General Assembly did give consideration to a full ADM for a pre-K student, full day, full school year. I think that there are about 20 districts that are approximating full day, full school year right now. Jay pointed out that the budgetary implications wouldn't be measurable, particularly in the upcoming fiscal year, because the places that are doing it are already there. I don't think there would be any rush on the bank if the state said that. I think that you would get a useful evolution of expanding capacity within the public schools for 4-year-olds, first as an educational strategy. That's the business that they're in. And second, as sort of an augmentation to the system that we have in place right now. Let me make this last final statement, and then if there's time for questions, I'll answer one. We eagerly would work with the entire early care and education delivery system in terms of carrying this out. There should not be any division. I don't think that work needs to rely on a very exhaustive study of all kinds of questions that emerged from apparently may have emerged from the survey that was done of the early care providers who are part of the early care delivery system more than they are the early education delivery system. And they do have some things to fear because economic viability is a motivator. So I think that needs to be paid attention to. And I don't think it's going to be worked out in this legislative session, but if the General Assembly saw fit to say, we will provide a full ADM for school districts that are offering full day pre-K, you're going to be able to not only support what's the good work that's happening in Windsor Central, but you're going to be able to really assist what's happening in Winooski, which when you consider the childcare desert that they have in Winooski, in the middle of Chittenden County, with a population that needs education and early care services. I was surprised to learn in their presentation that they don't have capacity. The best method to serve the households in that community would be through the public schools themselves, because was fumbling looking for this slide. I don't know, you haven't heard from Winooski yet, have you? No. It would be useful. Maybelline Lopez, the Director of Early Learning there. And that I have the slides that they were going to present to the Senate and did present upstairs in the Human Services Committee. The only pre-qualified program within Winooski is a Winooski School District affiliated Head Start program. And they told them they're not going to do it anymore. So, if you needed more sort of testimony in support of a full ADM, you could get it. So let me leave it there. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. I apologize for coming in really with only notes on a piece of paper, but I hope that what I said was understandable, at least to you. So thanks very much.
Great. I am actually going to give the committee 5 minutes, very strong 5 minutes back here. We already are delayed on our next testimony, but we will extend their testimony an extra 15 minutes by something else. But so thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And I just note, Jay took 20 minutes. I thought I could take 22.
We can try.
Thank you very much.
All right, so folks, a very solid 5 minute break. And to the folks waiting, appreciate your patience, and we'll be right with you at 12:15.